Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on informational interviewing. It's a great topic to kick off New Year career resolutions. I'm Valerie Dow at UC Berkeley Extension. For those of you who are new to Extension, I want you to know that we offer a wide range of courses and programs to help professionals advance in their careers and to make changes in their careers. We have classrooms in San Francisco and Berkeley and Belmont, as well as a large number of online programs. Several times a year, we run career-focused events like this, online and some in the classroom, to share career management tools and insights and best practices with our students and prospective students. We want to help you be successful in reaching your career goals. So a couple of points on the logistics for today. We will be sending an email out to you with a recording of today's presentation, and that will go out next week. Also note that if you have your presentation set to full screen, you'll need to click it down to bring it to a smaller size to show Q&A if you want to submit a question. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have during the Q&A session. Okay, now I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Terrie Moore, the lead counselor for UC Berkeley's Office of Staff Career Development. After a career in the healthcare industry, Terrie became a career counselor, coaching professionals in career transition. She holds 2 master's degrees in health services administration and in career counseling, and she holds outstanding career development programs for UC Berkeley staff. Welcome, Terrie Moore.
Thank you, Valerie, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'm delighted to be here with you to talk about informational interviewing. I believe that it's a powerful and underused tool for exploring career possibilities. So to get us started, what I'd like you to do is to think about a career dream that you've had. It can be past or present. It can be something that's very alive for you now or something that attracted you when you were younger. It might be a profession, an industry, or a specific company. Take a few seconds to think about what attracted you to that career. What interested you about it? Sometimes it's a highly visible feature, an aspect that we can see from the outside. For example, my nephew, who's now 35 years old, wanted to be a fireman at age 6 because the trucks were so shiny and fun. But wouldn't it be helpful as we explore careers as we reach that age to test those impressions early on? So I recommend getting a glimpse of the deeper reality by learning about the experience of insiders. So now think of at least one thing that you'd want to know about the career dream you identified a second ago. Before you'd want to dive in, what would you want to know? So I'm going to ask that we launch the live poll this morning. In relation to that career dream, please think about and select 1 or 2 categories that you would want to know more about. So go ahead and select those. I see we have some responses building. So in the meantime, let me just mention that informational interviewing helps people access information about the experience of other live, complex human beings like ourselves. The categories that you see on this screen are common themes where informational interviewing helps. So we're talking about day-to-day realities. What's the experience like to be in the field? What are the many different ways that people enter the field, and what makes them successful? I have to say that in my book, there's no more important question to ask than what could surprise you about a career, because sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. So these surprises come in many forms. An example being, of course, technology has really remade many professions. The point is that these questions aren't equally important to everybody. People relate to them differently. But collectively, they cover the main topics that you need live human beings' experience to appreciate. So what we see in the live poll is exactly that. 43 people selected what the career is really like. A slight edge goes to what it takes to be successful. How do people get into the career has some representation, and what could surprise us. Now, there are, as you can see, about 5% of people, 5 people have something else completely in mind. So what you can see, of course, is that this isn't everything you might want to know about a career, but it's an awfully good pick list, selection to choose from. And as a follow-up to today, you know that Valerie is going to send the presentation. It's going to come with a list of interview questions. They're meant to prompt your own thinking, to suggest questions that will really matter to you based on your own values, interests, and goals. And I can promise you they'll differ from one person to another. What you're seeing on this screen, though, shows that each theme includes more than one aspect. For example, people care about different things when exploring what a career is really like. For one person, family goals may make future income prospect the number one concern, but for someone else in a different circumstance, that might be contributing to a social cause or the intrinsic satisfactions of working with individual people. And I have to say, just to add, when was the last time that a job posting described the things about a career that are really unpleasant? Wouldn't those be nice to know about in advance so that you can weigh, are you willing to go down that road? Can you live with those aspects as well? Moving down to surprises, I think it's a good thing that most work life has surprises to keep it fresh and to add variety. But that's just not so obvious to people outside the profession. For example, I once worked with someone who was an accountant by training, and it was obvious to her early on that attention to detail was going to be critical in her work. What she didn't anticipate was the amount of travel that she was going to do as an auditor later in her career when I knew her. Well, to her, that was a perfectly fine surprise, actually a nice surprise. They come in both good and bad varieties, these surprises. And what you want to do is to anticipate the big, hairy surprises before diving in head first. So here's what we're going to cover today. What an informational interview is and what distinguishes it. Why and when they're helpful and appropriate, where they fit into your career journey, in other words. The steps that you can take to make them effective, from planning and preparation all the way through to follow-up. And last, some do's and don'ts are going to finish up our agenda before we answer questions as time permits. So, quite simply, an informational interview is a structured conversation with another person to gather information. And it can be about a profession, a career, an industry, someone's own career path, and so on. So no matter the focus, an informational interview is a tool for following your curiosity about a career that interests you. Now, the header on this slide may be a little bit of a head scratcher, but when I work with people individually, sometimes they describe feeling uncomfortable about asking for informational interviews. I get the question, how appropriate is it to ask for one? Is it too much to ask? And sometimes, quite frankly, people are afraid their contact is going to see them as an imposition. I've even heard people say that they're concerned that their contact may feel used by them. Well, okay, so what gives somebody the feeling they're being used? I think this is important to understand. Most often, in my opinion, that feeling comes from being put in a position that you didn't really agree to, or you didn't really have a choice about. So, for example, granting an informational interview to someone, which sounds low stakes, right? You're sharing information. But if in the middle of that you're asked if you can give that person a job, you're really put in an awkward position that you didn't anticipate. These are two very different kinds of interaction. So the solution is to be transparent about what your purpose is. Another way to think of this is to align your actions with what you asked for and with the agreements that you made. So here are 4 questions to ask yourself if you have qualms about requesting an informational interview. First, an informational interview is at its heart a personal request for information. So ask yourself, is my intent consistent with that? Second, does your contact have the option to say yes or no? You know, it's important to fully appreciate the fact that you're making a request, that you cannot expect an informational interview, but this is actually good news for you. I can promise you that not everybody is going to say yes, but that's okay. It doesn't mean anything about you. And once you accept that some people will decline, you're going to have a much better time. And I think you'll be surprised at how often people say yes. Third, keep all your agreements. The most obvious one is if you agreed to 20 minutes, keep your meeting to 20 minutes. Fourth and last, ask yourself, do you really want to know more about their field, industry, or role? You really want to ensure that you can answer yes to that. In fact, answering yes to all of these questions means that you have a very reasonable request to make of your contact. And I say, go for it with confidence. Here's the bottom line after all. Most people like talking about their experience to somebody who's interested. And actually, most people really like to be helpful, especially to someone who has shown initiative. And even though you're not in selling mode in an informational interview, your contact will get to know you along the way. So, being transparent about your objective really means knowing what informational interviews are and are not. Well, of course, both apples and oranges are fruit, but they're not the same thing. So let's talk about two other types of conversation that are similar to informational interviews in ways, but they're not the same. So, informational interviews and job interviews both have that same word in them, interviews, but they're obviously different. Don't confuse them because, after all, your goal in an informational interview is to explore, gather information. Very different from where you hope to be selected for a job. It's also important to distinguish them from networking. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but for now, I'd like you to just know that what you're after in these two kinds of conversations is really different. Exploratory information on the one hand, and connections and leads to opportunities on the other. So, in their book, Design Your Life, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans apply design thinking to developing your career. I recommend the book, by the way. A starting point really is the quest for a coherent career that aligns who you are and what you believe with what you do. That's your compass. Who you are and what you believe provide you with a guidance, the direction for knowing you're going in a good direction for you. You know, if you think about hiking and you're going off trail especially, you really want to have a compass to check your direction. Well, it's the same with career. So I want to share with you a different model just for a second. We use this in the staff career development program at UC Berkeley to illustrate the 5 distinct types of activity that are important to build a satisfying career journey. I want to encourage you, if you'd like to know more about this model, feel free to explore our website. The URL is on the screen and it will absolutely be on this slide when you receive the presentation later. But for purposes of today, the 2 pillars of self and environment are where we're going to linger. Informational interviewing lies at the intersection between these two. A moment ago, we talked about building your compass, which is primarily concerned actually with self. Informational interviewing, on the other hand, is a way to explore the outer world or the landscape of career possibilities, what this model calls the environment. And understanding both is indispensable to developing your career. So when might you want to ask for an informational interview? At various points in your career journey. Here are 4 examples. Early on in a career path, people may not have a lot of exposure to different alternatives, to what's out there. But in addition, throughout their career, people often face career change. In fact, estimates are that in the 21st century, people are likely to change careers up to 5 times or more. So this tool will be helpful to you for throughout your career journey. Third, there are times when multiple options simply present themselves, and they both look good from the outside. So how do you check that out? You can feel like you're in a dilemma. Well, information can be helpful. Last but not least, sometimes we just need very specific information in order to move forward. This often comes up when we're navigating, figuring out, finding a way to get from one place to another. So, informational interviewing should not be the first thing that you do to get career information. The point is that you want to start with general factual information that's widely available. That's going to give you a foundation for holding more effective conversations. You want your conversations to deepen your understanding through personal information that builds on what you can find in print and on websites. So, for example, if you're interested in a nursing career, you should already know the basic differences between a registered nurse, a nurse practitioner, and a licensed vocational nurse before you go talk to people. Your contacts are going to expect you to have some level of understanding, and you're going to ask better questions that way anyway. So I'm moving on here. Okay, I mentioned the relationship between networking and informational interviewing. For our purposes today, informational interviewing is a very specific tool within a larger sphere of networking. Now, one thing you see here is they both build relationships. They both allow you to become known and to build credibility with people you talk with, as well as your professionalism. Of course, the difference is their purpose, exploring and learning on the left, connecting to opportunities on the right, and as you can see, they happen at different times. So informational interviewing is a tool that you will use early and often. Now, the roles are going to be different. For instance, in an informational interview, you are the interviewer, and that's, of course, the opposite of a job interview. You contact the other person because their insight and perspective is going to be helpful to you. I'm calling that person your contact. So, as the interviewer, you've got the opportunity and also, by the way, the responsibility to plan and guide the meeting. That means being prepared, being active during the meeting, using good, attentive listening skills, and responding in a way that reflects your interest. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these 4 points. So planning, I have to say, is key, and the first step is that independent research we talked about. Second, of course, you need to identify people you want to meet with. So how do you find them? Start by reviewing the range of people you already know. This is actually a great time to list everybody in your contacts. That's going to help you later, too, when networking for opportunities becomes pivotal. But think broadly about who you know and who your contacts know also. Well, for example, I recently was approached by a colleague's friend for an informational interview about what I do. That happens all the time. Next, LinkedIn, of course, has become a very important research tool in career. It really shows how networks function. For example, in preparation for today, I quickly searched for other people in my field and my geographical area on LinkedIn using the search terms career counselor and Bay Area. Well, I turned up 10 people, and in every case, every single one, I either knew the person or we know people in common. So if I wanted to talk to any of those 10 people, I could ask a mutual connection to introduce me. Next, I firmly believe that professional organizations are underutilized. They're filled with people who are committed to their profession. Find out what the professional organizations are in the field you want to explore. And last, even trade publications. They publish articles and columns, and the authors of those can be great sources of information, and they often publish their contact information. Okay, so then of course you need to approach your contact. It's fine to approach them by email or even a LinkedIn message. Be sure to give them a little bit of a context about how you came to approach them in particular. If that was through a mutual contact, go ahead and say so. Indicating an interest or an acquaintance that you share in common actually helps your contact say yes to your request. Let them know what you want to get out of the meeting. In this example, it's to learn about Joe's experience in nursing as well as Joe's path into the profession. But get specific and very concrete about what you want, about your ask. I would say that 20 to 30 minutes is a reasonable amount of time to ask for. Logistically, make it easy for your contact. Ask about a time and place that's convenient for them. And sometimes meeting in person isn't feasible. So here's my advice. Aim to meet in the most personalized way that's feasible in your circumstance. Meeting by phone is fine, but you'll simply be missing the visual information, facial expression, body language that's part of human communication. It also means that they don't get that information about you, and I would say that multiple channels for communicating help people build relationships. So when you can, meet in person. When you can't, look for alternatives. Preparation means planning your questions, of course, and those questions should help you go beyond the data that you can find on your own. So this is a chance to discover what doesn't show up on the printed page. I like to say aim for the most open-ended questions you can and really favor, in the balance of questions you ask, lean toward questions that cannot be answered with one or two words like yes or no. That's actually the definition of an open-ended question that I like most. Those kinds of questions are going to pull for a narrative answer. So, of course, Valerie, when she sends you the presentation, you're also going to get a list, an extensive list of possible informational interview questions. They dive more deeply into these 5 themes that you see in front of you now. They're all open-ended, and what you might also notice is that they begin with words like what or how. And if in doubt, I would say think like a journalist. Ask questions that start with what, when, where, or how. So, for example, here are several. What's a typical day like for you? What do you find most satisfying? Or how is success measured in your field? There are several others here, of course, as well. How do you see this work aligning with your strengths and preferences? That's going to really prompt your contact to share with you. You might also ask, how did you get into this field? But, of course, there are factors that you just can't think of. So I always think it's a good idea to ask the most open-ended possible question, like, what else do you think someone should know when considering this work? Okay. The reason to prioritize your questions is primarily that you have limited time. It's important, I think, to limit the questions that you ask your contact to about 4. Sometimes you'll have time for 1 or 2 more, so be prepared with up to 6. But know which ones are most important to you so that you can cover those early in your time. Shooting for too many questions is going to impede the conversation flow, and your contact can start feeling cross-examined, and that's not something you want. It really doesn't say the best thing about you, and that's, of course, one thing you want to impart as your own professionalism. And I want to share with you that you want to think about the most important idea for you to explore at this point. And then last but not least, you want to prepare to introduce yourself as a professional in 30 seconds or less. Some people call this your elevator pitch. And I have to say it's one of the most flexible tools in a career search toolkit. You're going to need to deliver a snapshot of who you are professionally in informational interviews, but also in job interviews, networking events, many other settings. So it's a good investment to think about the vital few items that you want to get across. It shouldn't be a script. You're going to say it differently every single time, but it is simply a checklist of the points that you want to cover. So typically it will include the items you see here. What's your current field or role? The types of experience you've had generally that are relevant to the conversation you're going to have. Sometimes there might be an interesting feature that distinguishes you, such as a skill that's relevant in a novel way. And of course, currently, what's your aim or direction? Especially in informational interviews, this is often going to be exploring an area, like careers in healthcare, for example. So, for example, this person is an assistant manager in a drugstore. Their setting is a small chain where they supervise and oversee operations. Without detail, this person also indicates the range of their experience to span a national chain as well. A degree in biology might not be expected in a store manager, but it's also relevant to the conversation this person wants to learn about healthcare, so they elected to include it as a distinguishing feature in their introduction. Last, they share their interest in exploring healthcare and nursing, as well as what sparks it, what motivates it. In this case, really engaging with people directly. Okay, so now you're ready for your informational interview. The appointment time and the date arrive, and you're prepared for a good conversation. Now, a great feature of informational interview is that the stakes are kind of low, right? Your next job isn't riding on it, and so that makes it a pretty low stress experience. However, from time to time, I actually do talk to people who feel stressed about it. So let's talk about that. People sometimes say, gee, I'm imposing on them. This feels uncomfortable. This doesn't feel naturally to me. So I want to, again, suggest to you 5 questions. Will you stick to the kind of conversation you asked for? Are you sincerely interested in their experience? Will you be a good active listener? And that, by the way, that actually includes times when you may see things differently from your contact. You may even disagree on a point now and then. So just make note of that and move on. Don't dispute what they're saying to you. It's their experience. So think about it later. Will you stick to your agreement about the time? And will you express your thanks? And if you can say yes to these 5 questions, then go for it. You're ready. You've got an informational interviewing attitude. So in the meeting, you're responsible to keep things moving. Of course, you're going to briefly introduce yourself and your goal, and then ask your first question. Remember, go for the most important questions early. From there, balance your questions with the flow of the conversation. Ask if there's someone else that you should talk with. It's a good idea to ask for referrals. And, it goes without saying, but it's a good reminder to always close by expressing your thanks. So plan ahead so you close on time, with one exception. If you get into a really good conversation and your contact actively offers to spend more time with you, fine. Other than that, you need to plan to close on time. Okay, so a word about active listening. How you listen actually says something about you. Just as you get information from others' expressions, eye contact, and body language, they get information from yours. So be sure these visible aspects of your communication reflect your active, interested attention. I want to also mention paraphrasing because it's a really good tool for active listening. So what this consists of, when you hear an important point that's complex, is to simply paraphrase it in your own words to check your understanding. You might say, gee, it sounds like your first anatomy class really got you interested. Is that right? Well, so not only have you demonstrated that you'd like to hear some follow-up comments, but you've also really actively demonstrated your interest and your attention. Of course, ask clarifying questions when needed, and maybe most important, listen more than you talk. Okay, so now the interview's over. What do you do next? Keep in mind that an informational interview is you've heard one person's experience. This is where your compass comes back into play. There's no doubt that you have some things in common with the person you spoke with, but you probably have at least as many differences. So apply your compass. Spend some time after the conversation analyzing what you heard in view of what's important to you, and make some notes about that. As we discussed earlier, your compass, of course, is that combination of strengths, priorities, and even some aspects of personality that are important to align with the direction that you take with what you do. 100% alignment is rarely possible. I don't think I know anyone who has exactly 100% alignment with every preference they have. We just don't always get that. But a good question is, does this direction align well enough with what's important to me to be sustainable? That is a really good sense of alignment. So on top of the content you heard, you may have noticed that you had some reactions or feelings during the meeting in response to what you heard. I kind of like to say, use your feelings as data. They can act as clues to questions you'll want to explore further. So follow up. Be sure to send a thank you note within a day or two. So email is fine in most settings. I like to recommend that you be specific about one or two things that you appreciated particularly. Sometimes in the course of a meeting, you offered something to your contact, maybe an article or a name or an introduction. So be sure to follow through promptly. After all, through informational interviews, your contacts become part of your network. And that means that your network is filled with your working relationships. Well, credibility is really key to good relationships, and follow-through is key to good credibility. Last, remember to update your contact as your plans come together. People usually feel an investment in your progress, and they'll really enjoy hearing from you. So circle back in a few months. So I've put some final reminders together. I'd like to suggest that you especially pay attention to these items. Make sure your actions in the interview is aligned with your purpose. Come prepared with some basic knowledge through a little independent research. Prioritize your question. Honor all commitments, including the time limit. Dress professionally, and be sure to express your appreciation. On the don't side, keeping in mind that informational interviews are different from networking to get job leads, you might contact this person later to ask for job leads, and that's fine, but that's not usually part of an informational interview. I also think it's fine to take your resume. Some career coaches say not to. I say take it with you. Feel free to give it to your contact if you're asked for it, but this isn't the time to promote your resume because after all, it's going to change depending on what you learn from your informational interviews and other research. Your contact is the expert on their experience, so it doesn't make any sense to dispute their experience. It's also a mark of a not very good listener, and that's not something you want to convey. So, informational interviewing is a really powerful and enjoyable way to follow your curiosity, explore your future, and I know it's going to be productive for you, and I encourage you to try it out. So I think now we have some time for questions.
Great, Terrie. Thank you so much. It's a lot to think about. So we are getting questions coming in. Here's one to start with. When I haven't heard back from someone, I reached out via email. How long should I wait before paying them again? How many times should I try to reach the same person before I stop trying with them?
Yeah, that's a good question because it happens all the time. And thankfully, there are some guidelines for this. Every circumstance is going to change. However, it's safe and very reasonable to ping the person again in a week. If you don't hear back after that, ping them again in 2 weeks. So if after that many attempts you haven't heard back, it's probably time to move on.
Okay. Let's see. Here's one. I'd be interested in getting project-based work with a company. Can I use an informational interview to put that information out there?
So that really goes right to the heart of what an informational interview is for. And it may very well be that in an informational interview, your contact suggests to you that there are opportunities in their company or perhaps a project that's coming up for them. Let them take the lead on changing the contact from an informational interview to a networking exchange where you're learning about an opportunity. I think it's perfectly reasonable to put it out there that you are interested in moving toward project-based work. What I think you want to be careful about, though, is to use the opportunity to say, gosh, do you have a project that you could hire me for? That's when it really changes.
Okay, sounds good. What do you think about setting up an informational interview with someone who is more junior in an organization? Do you think it can still be beneficial? I think this person will be more accessible to me than some of the higher ups that I might go after.
Yeah, that sounds like an almost ideal situation to me. The reason is that the people at a more junior level are very likely to experience the same kind of thing that you would if you entered their field. Given that your goal right now is about research, I think it's a great strategy to start with people who are in similar roles that you would be, not necessarily in a position to hire you. In fact, you may get a more nuanced kind of sense of what the culture is like by talking with someone who is at a level where they experience the pluses and minuses of the company.
Okay. Let's see. What's a proper way to schedule a follow-up meeting?
So you may actually have a chance to do that at the end of your first meeting, right? It's perfectly fine to ask your contact, would you be willing to meet with me in about 3 weeks or a month after I've had a chance to explore some of the things we've discussed today? And then be guided by their response. If that's not something that comes up in the moment, then when you follow up to let them know about your progress, that's a very good time to suggest a follow-up.
Okay. Let's see. Someone has asked, how can I reach potential contacts if LinkedIn doesn't provide connections, if the connection is cold to me?
So there are 2 ways I want to speak to this question, and one is start early to build your LinkedIn network. The more people you are connected to in LinkedIn, the more options you have to move in multiple directions with your contacts. So sometimes how we say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, in this case, starting early to build your network is going to give you more options later. Don't rely solely on LinkedIn, however. You may, if you're not at that place where LinkedIn is offering you contacts who you have mutual acquaintance, then I would say it's time to call on people who you know in your non-virtual life, people you encounter day to day.
Okay. So here's a question. If I go out for coffee with my interviewee, do I pay for coffee?
Yeah, good question. My answer is yes. Some people actually say it's not expected, and that may be true, especially if you meet someone for lunch or dinner. I don't find that's the typical scenario, though. In general, when someone is doing you this favor and they're really contributing their time to your welfare, I think it's good and professional for you to pick up the tab.
Okay. Let's see here. Let me scan here.
So there's a question here about earnings. Is it all right to ask my contact about earnings in the field? The answer is absolutely yes. I think that you want to be thoughtful how you ask it. So you might not say, well, okay, Susie, how much do you make? I don't think that's the way to ask it, but it's perfectly reasonable to ask, what's a realistic starting salary, and how do you see income growth playing out in your field? Someone has asked here, as someone who's between careers at the moment, how can you make sure that the contact doesn't feel like you're pressing them for job leads? I think I think you'll be surprised at how willing people are to talk with you about their experience. I think I always favor saying what you are interested in more than putting out there what you're not interested in. So when you make the approach, if you request specifically that you want to learn about a field, I think that you've gone a long way to make sure that you've communicated clearly and cleanly. I think if you pick up a sense that your contact is concerned, you can say, yeah, it's really premature for me to be looking at specific jobs. At this point, I'm specifically interested in learning about your field. I suspect you'll find that very workable. So someone asks, do you let the interviewee take the lead on where to meet? What if they want to meet at their office or office lunchroom? Could there be any unforeseen issues with that? Well, never say never, but I think generally speaking, meeting in their office should be fine. There may be a question in your mind about whether you'll encounter people there who you might meet for a different reason later, and you want to avoid that. So if that is the case, for instance, maybe it's a company with close ties to your own, for example, and maybe you know some of the same people. Well, I think it's perfectly fine to make the approach a little more specific than where would you like to meet. You might say, is there a coffee shop close to your offices that would be convenient for you? So you're giving some guidance while letting your contact know that you really want to make it convenient for them. Let's see. Someone indicates that they have found some of their informational interviews not to be very helpful, and that they feel like they might be asking the wrong questions. How can I find the right questions to ask? Yeah, so first of all, I hope that you'll take a look at the list of questions that Valerie is going to be sending to you with the presentation file. There are 2 pages of potential questions. You need to be selective, but we did everything we could to give a broad sampling. So honestly, even more important than the exact question you ask is probably what are the things in your mind? If you're at a point where you're wondering if you want to launch into a completely new career that means going for some new education, then you probably want to ask questions related to that, related to entry to the field. If that's not your situation, then your questions need to be really in tune with what is front of mind for you now if it's something about the culture of the company, for example, or what it's like to work with the structure of jobs there. The kind of thing I mean are things like how much travel there is and what are the hours like. You want to ask more logistically oriented questions. I hope that helps. So thanks for your patience while we scroll through questions. Here's one. Is it okay for an informational interview with someone within HR, since they are the ones that know a lot about the company and jobs? Well, I think that when someone is asking about what kinds of jobs are out there, what are opportunities coming up, that really is more of a networking question. It's perfectly fine to ask those questions. Just be aware that in an informational interview with an HR person, you would probably be asking things like, I'm interested in working in HR over the next few years. What do I need to know about your field? That's the purpose of an informational interviewing. But certainly the interest in what the landscape looks like in a company is very relevant to many people. And there's certainly nothing wrong with seeking information about the kinds of opportunities coming up.
All right, well, we're going to wrap up shortly. Let's take one more question, Terrie.
Yeah, I see one. Would it be inappropriate to ask what kind of people are generally attracted to their career? No, that's not inappropriate at all. My suggestion, however, would to make it be a little more specific. The reason I say this is when we ask what kind of people are generally attracted, well, that could be, are we talking about people who wear yellow shoelaces versus white shoelaces? Well, that's not helpful to you. So if you can ask something that's a little more specific, you'll get better information. For example, what kinds of skill sets seem to come along with people in your field? Or what kind of working style do people tend to have in your field? So see if you can dig a little deeper about what attributes or commonalities you're really concerned about.
Terrie, these are great tips that you're passing along. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We will be sending out an email next week with a link to the recording as well as the presentation. And look for other webinars that we'll be offering later in the year. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Terrie.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good luck, everyone.